So the United States just announced the deployment of 10 F-35 stealth fighters for the ongoing counter-narcotics operation in the Caribbean. This follows multiple administration officials suggesting that what we've seen so far directed towards Nicolas Maduro and Venezuela is just the beginning. So I think it's important to get a little background to better understand these events as they play out. Today we're talking with Juan Gonzalez. Juan is a former National Security Council Senior Director for the Western Hemisphere and currently a resident fellow at the Georgetown Americas Institute. We get into Maduro's dirty tricks to steal the 2024 election, how Venezuela's oil plays into this situation, and more. You can follow Juan on X. His profile will be linked in the description below. And with that, let's get to the conversation. All right, Juan, thank you so much for taking the time to talk for a little bit, man. Looking to pick your brain on what exactly is happening with Venezuela right now.
I mean, that's a big question. Right now, there seems to be a standoff between the United States, which has deployed, a fleet. We have submarines, submersibles that can take the shore. Right now, we just heard that 10 F-35s are being deployed to Puerto Rico under the guises of a counter-narcotic mission. You'll recall there was a designation of the Tren de Aragua, which is a criminal group that began in Venezuela, was designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And that's, I think, one of the justifications that the administration has used to deploy the military against this threat. And on the other side, in Venezuela, you have a leader, de facto leader, who robbed the elections last year and has been basically cracking down on dissent much more aggressively to maintain control. And so the United States is trying to promote a change and really putting a lot of pressure on Venezuela. At the same time, though, there's still a migration relationship. So the United States is repatriating migrants still to Venezuela, and they approved a license that will allow Chevron to export petroleum to the United States. So there's a bit of a contradiction in the policy, so to speak. And if I were to sum it down, and we can unpack this, what I think the administration is doing is less of a counter-narcotics mission and more to really put a threat or put pressure on Caracas so that the military rises up, or so that Maduro is seen as a liability, and they decide to change the regime. But there's a lot more there that we should unpack on how complicated that is. But that's basically the current state of play.
And I should mention we're recording this the afternoon of September 5th. So no doubt by the time we hit stop record, there will be something new. But a couple things I'd like to get your take on. Oil is one, and I'll come back to a specific question there. But can you explain a little bit the issues with the election and Maduro? Because that's entering the news more now, but what exactly happened there?
Yes. So Hugo Chavez was elected in 1998, and from then on, he consistently won elections. Right. I was in the White House when Hugo Chavez died during the Obama administration, and it was the transition to Nicolas Maduro, who's the current leader. When he assumed power, he would consistently lose elections, but would manipulate the outcome. During the Biden administration, I advised the president, and I led the negotiations with Venezuela to try to get them to open the democratic space. I think we had a brief opening that during the primaries, they allowed the opposition to actually designate a candidate. There were a number of things that they did do, but when it came to actually allowing an election where they did not control the outcome, that's something that I think we were very skeptical that they would allow that. And sure enough, once July 28th came, what ended up happening was the results miraculously ended up in Maduro's favor, despite the polls showing totally to the contrary. They hid all the kind of ballot certifications that would have validated the result. And since that point, they've basically hunkered down. We in the Biden administration provided some sanctions relief as an incentive. We pulled all that back after they took the election. I think one of the things that we succeeded in doing was convincing the full political spectrum of Latin America, from the left, center, and right, to really put a spotlight on what Maduro did, which was steal an election and then use a repressive apparatus to oppress dissent, control the media. They even control the curriculum at the schools, all to really control this. Now, there are pockets of democracy inside of Venezuela, but they're usually at the governor and mayoral level. But the prize has always been between the opposition and the current regime has been really the presidency is the main prize that they've been fighting over since 1998, basically.
And did I hear you did you mention that this is these illegitimate elections, we'll call it, that had been a staple? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, ever since Maduro came to power, they would manipulate the results either by preemptively preventing candidates from running. They would do the equivalent, like they would take the Democratic Party's name and their entire apparatus and force the Democrats to start a whole new party, right? So they would take the brand away. They would take any sort of candidate that was popular. They would take them off the table. Maria Corina Machado, who ran in the primary, she would have won hands down. They did not allow her to run, despite a lot of the pressure that we put on them. And so it's either in the run up to the election or on July 28th, the actual election where they manipulated the ballots. They've been controlling the elections ever since Maduro came to power.
And this most recent election, was this any more dramatic or any more extreme, or was it just the most recent time that this has happened?
It's the most recent time, but it's one where we tried a different approach as the United States, right? We had, during the Trump administration, they took a maximum pressure approach. So sectoral and individual sanctions that, there was poor economic management by Venezuelans that put the economy in dire straits. But then the sectoral sanctions basically shut down their export economy and drove the petroleum sales toward China and other actors. What we tried to do was offer some incentives by, offering some sanctions relief. We also started negotiations with them to try to get them to do something. And what was new was, we created, I think, this democratic opening because the primaries would not have happened if we'd not engaged. I don't think there would have been this opportunity for Juan Gonzalez, who was the candidate that ultimately won, to even compete in these elections. And now I think what's happening in the United States and what's happening in Venezuela is the question is, what is the right direction that the United States should take to promote change in a country like Venezuela? And this administration's approach is to not negotiate, but to really put a lot of the military pressure on. So we're kind of testing a lot of these theories of change that, for a long time, there was, I think, inertia around U.S. policy toward countries like Venezuela. Trump 1 tried max pressure. That didn't work. We tried negotiations. That didn't work. And now this administration is trying the military route. And my view is that that won't work either. But, I think that's what's been singular, right?
So military route for what? Is it the idea of having Maduro step down, becoming more democratic? What's the kind of end state that your administration or you think the current administration is kind of moving towards?
That's the key question here. When you see Rubio on the trip that he took to Mexico and Ecuador, he's really focused on a counter-narcotics mission. I think what and obviously, I think the merger of the war on drugs and the war on terror is a very new approach for the United States that we can talk about. Again, what I think that this administration is doing is I think they have read, and this is something that elements of the opposition have believed for a long time. It's similar kind of groupthink that exists on Cuba that you can convince the military to turn against Maduro. And I have serious doubts on that theory because every single member of the military that is around Caracas or is around Maduro has been hand selected. They're under a microscope. The Cubans excel at counter intel ops. If they ever find anybody who steps out of line, they'll go to the worst prisons and get tortured to death. So the military is very loyal. So that's, I think, unlikely to succeed. But then the question is, if that's not going to work, what's the escalation on the part of the United States? Are they going to impose a naval blockade to prevent oil from leaving the country, therefore shutting down the economy? Will they fire one of the, I think, over 200 Tomahawk missiles that they have in the deployment to take out, to try to find a way to take out Maduro directly or to take out infrastructure to sow chaos in the country. That's a possibility. I think any sort of scenario where the United States succeeds in getting Maduro to leave, that's really only the beginning of the conversation. Because again, you have over 25 years of Chavismo, and today they control the entire country. The only way somebody like Maria Corina Machado or Edmundo Gonzalez can govern effectively is if the United States provides security guarantees. And in my view, that requires boots on the ground. And I think that's a very dangerous proposition. It's a debate that we're not having in the United States. That's why I've been doing a lot of press to say, okay, we should be having a conversation before we stumble into another forever war, right? This president was elected to pull us out of those. This is going to be one. And anybody who thinks that, the Paul Wolfowitz unfortunate quote that we'll be greeted as liberators in Venezuela really doesn't understand the dynamics inside of the country. Are much more complex than I think people.
Well, an interesting piece there is we're seeing a lot of circulation of the opposition figures in Venezuela on U.S. media, and they are the ones saying, come on, we love this. Get over here. Finally, about time. And that it's good to note that is not the entire population or even a significant portion, but it's in their best interest as the opposition party to root for anybody to try to topple Maduro. The oil conversation real quick, because this is one that I think it comes up a lot, and you can look at charts of how much oil Venezuela has. And I've seen a lot of commentary shift towards, you might think this is about counter narcotics or democracy or whatever, but look at Venezuela's oil. But my understanding is that it's not good, or if there's not a lot of value there. Can you open that up a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, but you're right. I think the conversation today is about power and who controls power in Venezuela. And the challenge is that one side, whether it's the regime or the opposition, one side is trying to destroy the other. There's no dialogue on how we can actually, move toward a democratic Venezuela. It's about control, power. And I think we need to think about it in those terms, aside from, despite a lot of the rhetoric to the contrary, which is really about building narrative. True, Venezuela has some of the largest oil reserves. It is heavy oil, so it requires. So it's actually, there's a symbiosis between Venezuelan oil and U.S. refineries in Louisiana. When we stopped importing oil from Venezuela, we actually had to replace that with Russian oil. So when we got to this point where we stopped importing Russian oil, the refineries in Louisiana were in a position where they just could not operate as effectively as they could. Now that's been remedied, but it's not just the oil. Venezuela, by accident, I think a year and a half ago, discovered 1 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. And by some estimates, they will rival, Qatar in the reserves that they have. They have the largest supplies, reserves of gold in Latin America. They have vital rare earth elements. So there's a lot. And obviously, in terms of the business opportunities, the rebuilding of that country is something that, could really benefit U.S. companies, and the rebuilding of the electricity grid, the broader infrastructure, all that stuff is a huge opportunity. Beyond the economic piece, it is also a place where the absence of the United States has created a strategic opening for China and Russia. That you have China that is active in the upstream in Venezuela. Russia is all over the sector. And there is a danger that, Maduro right now has been, trying to attract, engage with the United States by offering up the Venezuelan economy. Maria Corina Machado has done the same. What I'm concerned about, at some point, Maduro will say, okay, well, this is not going to pan out. I'm just going to invite China and Russia to develop the gas sector or the rare earth minerals, and that'll just expand their presence inside of Venezuela in a way that, frankly, is contrary to our national interest.
I would love to accidentally stumble into like generational national deposits, wealth. Like, all right, good for Venezuela. Hopefully that can be put to good use and help the people there. You're talking about Russia and China, definitely U.S. adversaries with some interest in Venezuela. When we look at the region, as this continues to progress, what alliances in South America, Central America, are you looking at to see, do they line up with Venezuela? Do they line up with the United States? Do they stay neutral? What are some key countries to keep an eye on?
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically been divided in terms of left and right, and in Latin America, the pendulum's been swinging back and forth. Key allies for the United States have been, I think you'd see countries like Argentina, Paraguay, Ecuador, and others that tend to be toward the right. But even on the left, which would be siding really with Venezuela, they've been less full throated in their defense of Maduro for a number, with the exception of Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and that's, I think, because right now Latin America, I think, understands that this administration is much more transactional, and they want to preserve their space to transact. I also think that the left in Latin America recognizes Maduro for what he is, which is an autocrat who stole the election, and you don't really want to come to that defense. But the challenge for this administration is going to be that any sort of military intervention will actually, or these threats of military intervention are strengthening Maduro domestically, number one. It may actually unify the hemisphere against the United States, given that Latin America and the Caribbean are very, very protective of their sovereignty given kind of past U.S. interventions. And so that may be something that may make it much more difficult for the United States to really put together a coalition of allies, even though they've convinced, Marco Rubio has been very effective at convincing some of the right of center countries to also designate Tren de Agua as a foreign terrorist organization. So I know that Paraguay has done that already. I believe Ecuador may have. And so others are doing it, but they're doing it at the request of the United States, not because they actually, at least the diplomats I talked to, they know that the evidence is tenuous, but they need to transact with the United States, and so they're going to do that so that they can, maybe find inroads when it comes to tariff negotiations or anything else that they need with the U.S.
That's a good point about just the violations of sovereignty, or the perceived violations of sovereignty, and how critical that could be. Is there anything, this strike that just like 48 hours ago, so it's very recent, but I could see that being something that other countries might look at as a concern around the sovereignty of, look, from everything we know, these were Venezuelan traffickers moving drugs to the United States, like bad dudes across the board. So it's not as though they're looking at him saying, I hope the United States doesn't kill our citizens. But was that, have you seen that conversation brought up, the sovereignty question, by anyone looking at that?
I mean, primarily by Colombia, but I know that other countries in the hemisphere, at least diplomats that I've and officials that I've talked to, are concerned by that trend, or this being a precedent that the United States sets, because rules of engagement exist to protect the innocent, and an approach where you're shooting first and asking questions later, I think, opens the door toward civilian casualties. And I'll kind of point out, in 2001, we had an air bridge denial program in Peru, meaning we provided intel so they could shoot down counter-narcotics planes. Protocol wasn't followed, and they shot down a missionary plane. So that will happen eventually if they keep doing these sorts of things. I think it's alarming for folks. But others, like, you've heard Trinidad and Tobago come out very strongly in rejection of, in support of the administration's efforts on counter-narcotics. Nobody's going to shed a tear over a bunch of narcos getting killed at sea. The danger is, what if you kill migrants, or you kill somebody on that's just out for a ride. I was joking after probably poor taste. I was like, I hope Disney Cruises is not in the area, because an approach of shoot first, ask questions later is just very dangerous proposition.
Or maybe that Disney cruise, they were outside sitting on the deck thinking they were going to see some fireworks, and actually saw a hellfire rain down over the horizon. That's a different experience.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of background here between Venezuela and the United States, and Maduro and Tren de Agua and the cartels and drug trafficking. So it seems like the groundwork has been there for a long time to say bad things happening, we need to take some sort of action. Why now? Was there anything that kind of pushed, in your opinion, the Trump administration over the line to say we need to take action? Or was it just kind of we were moving in this direction, it was going to happen sooner?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I think what's happening right now is largely a political motivation, and let me explain why. Because so the Tren de Agua FTO designation is not supported by the evidence. Again, I'm not defending Maduro. The guy's an autocrat. He has a repressive state. The Tren de Agua criminal group exists and operates in various countries. But if you ask the Colombians, right, who deal with a lot of security issues, where's Trinidad on your top 10 list? And they would say it's not even nowhere near the top 10 list. They're a much smaller group. Venezuela is largely a transshipment country. The coke comes from Colombia, and frankly, roughly 2/3 of the cocaine that comes to this country comes in from the Pacific. What started happening during the campaign and thereafter was the opposition started laying down this narrative on the Trinidad Agua. There were articles and blogs that were being published. They've been very effective at building this narrative that paint Trinidad Agua as this cartel with Nicolas Maduro as the head of this organization, as well as the Cartel del Soles. But the fact is that the evidence does not support that. If it did, the Biden administration would have been much more. I think we would have been much more reluctant to engage with them, and I think it would have informed a different approach. But a lot of these intel reports that are kind of the annual threat assessments that are published, if you see consistently, the intelligence community says Nicaragua does exist. There is drug trafficking inside of Venezuela. Officials are involved. We don't see a kind of command and control structure around Nicaragua that is led by Maduro. And that it worries me that we've gotten to this point because, we do have a history of going into countries under false pretenses. Intel that sent George W. into Iraq is I think there's a dangerous precedent for that. And I think I'm a Democrat. I have a bias here. I don't agree with a lot of what this administration is doing. And so, you got to kind of have that context on what I'm about to say. I think that Marco Rubio has been listening very much to kind of the Venezuelan diaspora that is primarily in South Florida. But now he has to sell this plan to the rest of the American people. And I think that's what's happening now. What worries me is that I think any sort of characterization of this as being easy is I think underselling. And frankly, if that's what they're telling the president, it's malpractice. I think they have to lay out really what the challenges are because, and I don't want to go off on a tangent here, but in Venezuela, the ingredients exist for there to be an internal armed conflict. They really do. And so it's something that if the United States goes in, we really should be eyes open on what the implications are of the United States really getting involved militarily in a country like Venezuela. And really, do we want to send our 18 and 19-year-olds to fight another war when there may be other options available?
The hyping up, if you will, of Trinidad Agua reminds me of that your example of going into Iraq, the work done to paint Zarqawi as an Al-Qaeda mastermind, and essentially bin Laden at that point going, who are you talking about? Like there had been kind of loose connections, but Zarqawi was essentially running his own group up in northern Iraq, and all of a sudden we had his face at the United Nations saying, look at this Al-Qaeda operative leading the charge, and we kind of created bad dude, 100%. But we kind of built him up in a way that maybe he wasn't there in the first place. It's kind of don't like when anything from that conflict, the leading days from that conflict play out anytime recent. But
you know what I'm sorry to cut you off, but it's from a Latin American perspective, I got to say, I understand how the Venezuelans would say, well, look, the United States spent 20 years and $20 billion in Afghanistan. Venezuela will be a much better return on investment by comparison. You guys invaded Iraq. Venezuela will be much easier to, and they're right. But that the question that Americans need to ask themselves is, do we want to be getting involved in other forums? Because then you start with Venezuela, and then what do? You do Nicaragua next? Do you do Cuba next? And that's I think a question that the American people really need to be consulted on, right?
Well, the way that's being framed right now, and I'm sure you're seeing this, is it's not about democracy in any of these countries or future trade or economic benefit for the United States. It's destroying cartels and eliminating drugs flowing into this country. That's how it's being framed 100%. I think it was Hegseth maybe a couple days ago that referred to Maduro as a kingpin. So we are setting this up as this is exclusively about drugs. And I think when you survey the American people, that's an easy sell compared to the Taliban, for instance. Well, all right, let's walk it back 20 plus years and we'll explain to you why the Taliban and the US don't get along. But stopping cartels that are delivering drugs that are killing Americans, to me, seems like a pretty easy sale.
it's an easy sale until you're on the ground and you get stuck there, and because I mean, again, like Colombia, where I was born, and it's a country I've studied, they've been in a internal armed conflict for over 50 years, right? And the US helped them kind of come back from the brink. But the guerrilla fighters that exist in South America in particular are some of the best in the world at jungle warfare, at urban warfare. And look, the US is excellent at head-on fights with conventional military. When it comes to the National Liberation Army that controls large swaths of the western part of Venezuela, you have other criminal groups that control the east. Caracas may actually be somewhat stable, but there are parts of that country that I think will be difficult to pacify. And once the U.S. kind of comes in, it'll be a cost of lead for every illegal armed group in South America. Now, how is that different from Afghanistan, for other places? Well, that's because Venezuelans can literally walk here, and that's one of the reasons why we've had a major migration problem. It's the economy in Venezuela, the political oppression has prompted the outflow of over 7 million Venezuelans, 3 million of which are in Colombia, and a lot of which during the Biden administration, particularly in the post-pandemic, flooded the borders of the United States. Well, you drive Venezuela into a conflict, it doesn't matter what policies this administration has on kind of migration enforcement, they will come here, right? And so there are broader implications where you can sell the narco-terrorist link, right? In Colombia, Alvaro Uribe did that very well in 2001, brought back Colombia from the brink by really merging the war on drugs with the war on terror, with our help, frankly. But I think people need to understand that this is a protected proposition, not an easy like layup.
What are you keeping an eye on here, Juan? For the next, call it 10 to 14 days, what are you watching to see how this develops?
Number one is escalation on the part of the United States. The Secretary of Defense said that this was not the last operation. So what does this look like? We also saw reports that 2 F-16s flew near a U.S. Navy vessel. Are we going to have a direct confrontation between the two, and where's that going to head? I think the other one is, how do the Venezuelans react? The saber rattling could quickly lead to an accident where we stumble into this. That's something that I'm very concerned about. And then the third is, what do China and Russia do? Because China and Russia have strategic interests inside of Venezuela. And that is not just their presence in the kind of oil sector. It is the Venezuela's entire air defenses and radar are managed by the Chinese and the Russians, but also all their kind of intel capabilities in the region are in places like Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. And so how does China behave? I was not entirely surprised to see that Maduro was not at the meeting with Xi Jinping, because I think he's probably concerned he was going to get shot out of the sky. But what are they going to do to try to to actually support them? In the past, since 2013, Russia has been sending strategic nuclear bombers to Venezuela to kind of as a saber rattling move against the United States. What are the Russians going to do? Because they have, they're effectively a client state of Russia and China at this point.
It's a lot. All right. Well, Juan, thank you so much for breaking this down, man. We've spent a lot of time getting into kind of the military aspects and the threatening language back and forth, but it's been really, really helpful to step back and get kind of a better picture of this relationship writ large. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So thank you again so much to Juan for taking the time to walk through all of that. I know this is something that I'm guilty of personally, which is trying to assign a simple rationale for an action. Like the reason something happened is X, and that's it. Because it's easy to understand, easy to articulate, but that's also never the case. And I think Juan did a really good job of kind of running through the history here, just the recent history between the United States since Maduro came into power, and the challenges that we've had between our two countries and how it plays into the bigger geopolitical picture. And that's not even getting into, although we did touch on, of course, the drug trade and the drugs being moved from Venezuela to the United States. So as we see this situation continue to develop between the United States and Venezuela and the Caribbean, hopefully this is some helpful added context to better understand what we're seeing play out day in and day out. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.